This morning's scripture comes from Genesis 1:1-5. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day.
Amen. Amen. Children are free to head out to children's church. Amen. Thank you, Charlie, for reading that for us this morning. I've been praying all week about that particular passage of Scripture, and as I've been praying about it, the Lord just kept reminding me of two questions. Two questions I've asked him, I think, a million times. Two questions that as a pastor, I've had people in my office asking me over and over again. They're really simple. Where is God? And what is he doing? You familiar with these questions? Like, I remember a season in my life when I was in college, and every single church service I went to, every campus service I went to, every devotional I picked up, I swear every page of the Bible that I looked at for months on end was on one topic: forgiving those who have hurt us. And I didn't want to hear it, and I wasn't interested. And I kept asking that question, where is God? He was saying, you're kind of slow on the uptake. And when I figured out where he was, I said, but what are you doing? Because I don't want to have this conversation with you. About that same time period, several years ago, my grandma, we called her Granny. Okay, I called her Granny, and I got all the other grandkids to do it, and it drove her up the wall. But Granny started having mini strokes. And she had one after the next, after the next, after the next, until we reached the point where Granny couldn't speak, she couldn't walk, she couldn't feed herself. The only thing she could do was cry. And anytime you would go to visit her, she would just sob. And my mom would call me because Granny was staying at a nursing home in the same town my mom lived in. Every time she picked up the phone, she'd say, Kelly, where is God? And what's he doing? And a friend back in Norristown, he's in his early 20s, and he loves science. God bless him. I'm glad somebody does. He loved biology and geology, pretty much anything that got him outside. And that was his undergrad degree, and he has spent the last 4 years applying for, and I'm not joking, any job in the science field that will get him outside. And for the last 4 years, at best, he has received rejection letters. Most of the time, he just doesn't hear anything. He's working at an advanced auto parts, and it's a great job. It's paying the bills, but it is not what he wants. And every time we would sit down for a cup of coffee, he would say, where is God in this? And what's he doing? Now, I find that those are the two questions that get asked of me the most as a pastor. And they always come in those seasons of life where things are either very dry or very dark. Because frankly, when everything's going well, we don't tend to stop and say, hey, God, where are you? It's in the moments where things hurt. And the Lord must have known that those were the two questions we were going to ask a great deal of, because I think those are the two questions that he answers very beginning, right from the get-go, as he introduces himself in Genesis chapter 1. So you remember that we talked last week very briefly about Genesis 1 and the reality that it is Hebrew poetry. It is beautiful poetry. And it is Hebrew poetry that is not actually about when did God create the heavens and the earth. There's no date attached to it. It is not even about how did he create the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1 is plain and simple about who it is who created the heavens and the earth. It's God's way of introducing himself to us. And so right after we saw last week, right, that God introduces himself as the only one who has the power and the authority to name us, right? He is more powerful than any situation, any other person, no matter how much they want to label us. He's more powerful even than me. He's the only one who defines who I am. Right after that, God says, and let me tell you where I am and what I am always doing. So I want us to go deep in Genesis chapter 1. So if you have a Bible and it's not already opened, open it. I don't care if it's in print form, if it's on your tablet, on your iPhone, but you should always have this. Mostly because you never trust a preacher. Ever. You always look and say, did they make it up or is that what it says? I'm not joking. Genesis 1, this is the very beginning. Genesis 1 verse 1 says this, in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, verse 2, verse 1, he says, this is what God did. Verse 2, he says, so let me tell you how that took place. And he begins to tell us in verse 2 about what the world was like before God showed up and started speaking creation into existence. Verse 2, he says, now the earth was formless and it was empty. Now, let's just pause there for a second. Right, the NIV I'm reading from says the earth was formless and it was empty. Now those two words in the Hebrew language are actually nouns, but we have a really hard time translating them into English in a way that makes any sense. That's why a whole bunch of your versions will say something slightly different. But what they boil down to is Moses says, in the beginning, before God created anything, he literally says the earth, the world was a barren wasteland, right? Now, I don't think that he actually meant that before God created anything, it looked like dried up dirt. But when Moses is writing Genesis 1, it's the 40 years in the wilderness. He's with the Israelite people. They're out in the middle of the desert. And as the Holy Spirit speaking to him about something he wasn't present to see, I can just picture Moses standing there going, I don't have words for what the world was like before God showed up and he spoke. And he looks out at that dry desert in which he lives, this place that is uninhabitable and uninhabited. And he says, well, it was kind of like that. Because before God showed up and started speaking, the world was this place where nobody could live, where there was no life and there was no chance for life. It was dry. And it was this place where nobody and nothing could be able to exist. In the beginning, the world was a wasteland. Moses goes on, right? And he says in the second part of verse 2, he says, and that same earth, darkness was over the surface of the deep. Now those two words are theologically loaded, right, as you read them throughout the rest of Scripture. Now sometimes darkness literally means the sun went down and it's dark. But most of the times when we read it in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, darkness takes on this meaning. It's symbolic of evil. Right? It's like my mom used to say that you needed to be home before it got dark. Not because she's scared of the dark, she's scared of what I was going to get into when it got dark. Right? Because in the dark, we're willing to do and be things we would not do in the light. So darkness carries this idea of evil. And then it says that darkness was over the surface of the deep. Okay? Now throughout the Old Testament especially, when we're talking about the deep, we're talking about the ocean or the sea. And you get a picture of who we're talking about. The Israelites dwelled in the desert. They didn't spend a whole lot of time on the wide open seas. And they found it kind of scary. So the deep comes to be representative of chaos, of something that's outside of your control, that's threatening. So Moses says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And before he created the heavens and the earth itself was dry wasteland. And it was evil and it was chaotic. Okay? And now here's the question. In this land that's dry, where nobody can live, in this place where evil is present and darkness is there and it is chaos, where's God? He tells you in the last part of that verse, doesn't he? The earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. I love that word. The Spirit of God was right there. That's where God was. He was immediately present in the midst of mess. He was there where life shouldn't be. He was present where everything seemed to be chaotic. Because that's always where God is. You know, the word that gets translated as spirit could also be translated as breath or as wind. But I think that the NIV does a really good job in saying, no, this isn't the breath of God. As in, God looked over there in the corner and said, that looks really messy and kind of bad. I think I'll stand way over here and kind of blow. No, it's the Spirit of God, right? God's not a God who says where things are messy and dark, I stand at a far distance. God's the God who says if everything's dry and everything's barren and everything's dark and everything's chaotic, I'm still there. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. I was looking at that word hovering because I got all sorts of images in my mind, like, hovercrafts and things like that. And I was thinking, and that was a funny image, but I was pretty sure that was not what Moses was going for here. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, Moses uses these exact same words. Okay, in Deuteronomy 32, he's talking not about the creation of the earth, but about the creation of Israel. And as he's talking about the creation of Israel, he takes the same words that he wrote in Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2, and he kind of amplifies them so we can know what he meant. So Deuteronomy 32, verse 10 says, "In a desert land, God found Jacob, in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and he cared for him, guarded him as the apple of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them on its pinions." Moses says go all the way back to the beginning, Genesis 1. He says, in this dry, dark place where chaos reigns, the Lord was hovering. And he's using the image of an eagle, right? An eagle that, as he says in Deuteronomy 32, sometimes stirs up the nest, right? He flaps his wings. When an eagle stirs up the nest and flaps his wings, it's because there's little eagles there who need to get out of the nest. Right? So sometimes the eagle is going to flap their wings and say it's time to take that next step. But Moses also says that sometimes that hovering is the Lord simply extending his wings in that space of saying, I'm here to shield and I'm here to protect. So you go back to Genesis 1. In the very beginning, God says this is how he introduces himself to us. He says, I'm the God that when everything's dry or everything's dark and everything's chaotic, where am I? I'm right there. I'm right in the midst of whatever it is that you're going through. And I am present as that eagle. Sometimes to say, I'm using this dry spot to get you to take a next step. Sometimes to say, I'm simply here to protect you. But let's keep going in Genesis 1. Because the God who is present in the midst of whatever it is that we're walking through, we need to understand what exactly it is that he's doing. Verse 3 says this, and God said, right, God the Father said, let there be light. And there was light. Now God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning, that first day. In the midst of this barren wasteland, this place that's formless and empty, where life can't take place, where chaos reigns and there's darkness, God's right there. And he's getting ready to give himself, right? I mean, if you've read Genesis 1 and you were in Sunday school and they made you memorize what took place on each day, then you know that it's on day 4 when God creates this luminary in the sky that itself issues light to the earth, and we call that the sun, right? That's day 4. But on day 1, God says, into this darkness, let there be light. And there's light. On day 1, 3 days before the sun gets created in Moses' poem, there's already light. And that has to mean but one thing. That God, when he says, let there be light, he's saying, let there be me. I'm going to shine myself into the creation. And you know what? When God shows up and says, let there be light, it doesn't matter how dark the dark was. The light overcomes. Period. Every time. And when light comes, then it is possible for something that's empty, something that's void, something that's uninhabited and uninhabitable to suddenly become a place where life can take place. In the very beginning, in this beautiful poem, God introduces himself to us, and he says, this is who I am. I am the God that is right where you are. That's where I am. And I'm the God who's there to give you myself. You know, when God gives us of himself, when he gives us his light, that's when life can take place. That's when the darkness disappears. That's when the driest, most barren wasteland can become, well, the Garden of Eden. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when I was in 11th grade lit class with Mr. Jeffries, when he got to the poetry portion, I zoned out. I drove Mr. Jeffries up the wall because he would say, it's beautiful, and I would say, but it makes no sense. And he would say, but it points to something wonderful, and I would say, then write about that. So God did just that. In Genesis 1, the Lord introduces us to himself, and he really does answer those questions. He does say, in the driest places, in the darkest of nights, where am I? I'm right there. What am I doing? I'm giving you myself. But for people like me, who really don't love poetry, he made it very concrete, because he gave us Jesus. John's gospel opens in John chapter 1, and he completely just replicates Genesis 1. And he says that where God is that he has taken on flesh, and he comes to dwell among us. And he said what God is doing is here, coming to give himself, to give light that gives us life. Because that's who Jesus is. Think about some of your favorite stories about how Jesus interacts with people. You know, Jesus is never one who stands at a distance. He shows up in the driest and darkest, not of places, but of lives. So John chapter 4, for instance, we meet Jesus with the woman at the well. Poor woman at the well, she kind of gets the shaft. I think she needs a name. Let's call her Sally. She has to be known as a woman of the well. So Sally, John chapter 4, Jesus comes to Sally, who's a Samaritan, right? So that means she is of a lineage that's half Jewish, half Gentile, and mostly not liked by anybody. And Sally comes to the well that is there in Samaria. She comes at the wrong time of day. She comes when it is blue blazes hot outside. And we presume she does that because she doesn't really want to meet anybody else. See, we discover as we read in John chapter 4 that Sally has had 5 husbands, and she's currently shacking up with guy number 6. You like this version? This is called the PKAV. That's the Pastor Kelly Amplified version. Someday I'll make a lot of money off of it. Sally's life story is one I really want to know. I want to get to glory someday and find out. Because I have some guesses, right? Like, I just imagine that when Sally was really, really young, a man came to her and said, I can get you out of your house, get you out from underneath your dad, and I'm going to offer you everything under the sun. And she said yes. And she got married. And probably wasn't too far into that marriage before she realized he made a lot of promises he can't keep. Now, I don't know what happened in that first marriage, but it must have dissolved. You know, maybe marriage number 2 was the man that she actually loved. And he loved her. Like, he was in it to bless her, not to just take from her. Maybe hubby number 2, pretty early in, died. And I bet that crushed Sally. I don't know about hubby number 3. Maybe guy number 3 came along, and he turned out to be incredibly abusive. And Sally had to run away. And by the time she got to hubby number 4, I bet Sally couldn't have tried to love anybody if she wanted to. That there would have been so much dryness in her life that it was like she was uninhabitable. And maybe hubby number 4 looked at her and said, I can't. I can't do a relationship with somebody that won't do it with me. Guy number 5 came and he went, and by the time she gets to guy number 6, Sally's looking at him and saying, I have done these vows 5 times. It has not worked out for me yet. Let's just cohabitate and split the chores. And at that point, Jesus shows up. Now you laugh, but imagine Sally's story. This is a woman whose life has got to be so dry. A woman who has no concept of what real love looks like. Somebody who looks at people and says, they're in and they're out of my life. They're here and then they're gone. And so what's the point? And Jesus shows up. And he doesn't stand at a distance like every other Jewish person did. You know, we're back to Genesis 1. He doesn't stand way over here and from a distance say, Sally, I hope life gets better. He gets right next to her. And she can't believe it. You read it. Read John chapter 4. When Jesus is talking to her, Sally looks at Jesus and says, "Hello. I don't think you understand that you're not supposed to talk to me." And Jesus just looks right back at her and says, "Sally, you're the reason I'm here." You know, you look at their conversation. Jesus looks at Sally and he says to her, "Your life is so dry. You are so thirsty. And I'm the only one who can quench your thirst." Now, Jesus comes to this woman whose life is uninhabitable, and he says, "I want to live with you." He comes to her and says, "I want to show you what real love looks like. I want to show you a love that's unconditional. It is not about me taking from you. It's about me giving myself to you." He says, "I want to show you a love. I want to show you love that will never end. It will never even end when you die." Jesus comes to Sally, and he comes like that Spirit of God hovering, flapping his wings, saying, "Hey, Sally, we're going to take a next step, honey, and your rest of your life is going to be different than the first part." Because that's what God does. Some of us here today, if you looked at your life right in this current season, you would say, it's really dry. Something has taken place, and it's like everything just got sucked right out of me. Guess who God is? See, if you're like Sally and you've been looking at the Lord saying, "Where are you?" Jesus is standing right here saying, "I'm right here. I am right here where you are, and I'm ready to give you me. I'm the only one who can take what's uninhabitable and make it come to life." Keep going in John's Gospel. You go just a couple chapters down to chapter 11, and you find Jesus coming one more time, stepping into a situation where people were literally saying, "Where is God?" Right? Because John chapter 11 is the story of Martha and Mary, two sisters, who are deep, deep in the midst of grief because their brother Lazarus has just died. And if you remember the story, you remember that when they realized that Lazarus was becoming sick, they send word to Jesus. And they say to him, "If you just show up, our brother won't die. We believe, we know you can heal him." And the Gospels tell us that when Jesus got word that Lazarus was dying, he didn't do anything. He didn't go. And so Lazarus died. By the time that Jesus shows up, 4 days have passed, and Mary and Martha, guys, they are in the midst of the dark night of their lives. Everything is chaotic. It's a tumultuous mess. And where's Jesus? You know where he is? He's right there with them. He's standing right beside them. As a matter of fact, John in his Gospels says the verse that everybody memorized when someone promised to give you a treat if you memorized a verse, right? Jesus wept. That Jesus is right there. But it's the most powerful image. If you read it in the Greek, outside of the verse that says Jesus wept, John says, he uses language about Jesus. I want you to picture a wild stallion, okay? Because the language he uses is of nostrils flaring, pawing the earth. It's anger. Jesus stands next to Mary and Martha, and he weeps with them, and he is angry at the fact that death has robbed them. That's called grief. As they're looking at Jesus going, "Where were you?" He says, "I am right here." He doesn't stand at a distance and tell them, just clean yourself up and stop acting this way, and then I'll come. He stands right beside them in their midst of their grief. He cries and is angry with them. But then he looks at them and says something remarkable. He says, "It's not just that I'm here with you. I am here to give you myself." And you picture Jesus, that hovering image, right? Hovering like the eagle, sheltering Mary and Martha and saying to them, "In me is the promise of life eternal. Today I can give you what you most long for." What they wanted more than anything was their brother back. And Jesus looks at them and says, "There will be a day." Now they didn't know it. That was going to be later that day. But there would be a day when they were going to be able to be with their brother forever. More importantly, they were going to be with Jesus forever. All they had to do is take what he wanted to give. When we look at Jesus, friends, we see this incredible promise about who God is. We see this most remarkable reality, which is the plain and simple truth that takes the poetry of Genesis 1 and makes it concrete and real. And you know, the promise of the good news in Jesus Christ is that it's still real today. He's still real. And his answer to those two questions is still the same. That means that whatever circumstances you find yourself in today, whatever they are, if you're looking back at the Lord and you say, man, my life is dry. God, I haven't felt like you were present in a long time. Or this area of my life feels like what was once so good is now just barren. And you look at the Lord and you say, God, where are you? Jesus' response to you is, I'm right here. Now the question is, do you believe that? See, I can know those answers, I can spout those answers, but they mean nothing unless I actually believe them. I haven't believed today that Jesus is here. And let me tell you a secret. In the dark spaces of life where things feel outside of our control and we are utterly convinced that there's nothing we can do to bring light, if we look back at Jesus and say, I don't feel like you are present, it doesn't matter. Feelings are wonderful indicators. They indicate when something's good happening. They indicate when there's something I need to deal with, but they're terrible directors. I don't have to feel like Jesus is present to believe that he is. I don't have to feel like he's capable of speaking light and light overcoming the darkness in my life for him to be capable to do it. All I have to do is believe it. When we come before this amazing God that we have, and we say to him, in my dryness and in my darkness, in the places where I can't see you and I can't feel you, I believe you are present. Jesus looks back at us and says, good, now you're ready to receive what I want to give. You see, whatever it is in your life right now that you feel like is lacking, that's who Jesus is. He is your light. He is your hope. He is your purpose. He is your love. He's your definition of success. Jesus is everything. But the question is, will you say yes to that? Now this morning we're going to spend a little bit of time in prayer. And what I want to invite you to do is to come before your God and Savior. See, he happens to already know your story. He knows what is barren. He knows what looks like a wasteland. He knows what's dark and what feels chaotic. And he is ready to answer that question that he's already here. So as we go into prayer, what I want to invite you to do is to come before the Lord and to say to him, Jesus, I'm ready for a new beginning. To come and to confess before him the place where you need him to be. Maybe you need to just come this morning and say, Lord, I don't feel like you're here. And ask him to convince you that he is. Maybe you want to come this morning and say, Jesus, I need to receive you. I want you to do for me what you did for Sally. I need you to do for me what you did for Mary and Martha. To show up right here and then give me of yourself. Let's pray together.